Canada at the turn of this century was in the midst of spectacular industrial growth. Across the country, railroads were built, and the lumber, mining, and manufacturing industries mushroomed. This rapid industrialization was orchestrated by a handful of powerful Canadians. The government opened the country to these barons of industry. They were given huge tracts of land, mineral concessions, and a free rein in development. But development required an abundant labor force, and government immigration policies were fashioned accordingly. Through these years, waves of immigrants crossed the oceans from Europe and the Orient. These new Canadians brought with them their labor, their spirit, and their hope for a better life. They found jobs, but for these jobs they were paid pitiful wages. Adults and children worked 12-hour days. Disease was rampant, and accidents multiplied unchecked. People lived in misery, but profits soared. But the dream of a decent life was still alive. Workers sought an avenue to compel their unwilling employers to improve wages and working conditions. They began to hold meetings, to gather together in each other's homes, and the idea took root that the only way to bring about change was through collective action. And so, across the country, industrial unionism was born.
I've seen good people working throughout this mighty land, and I prayed we'd get together and together make a stand. Then we might own those banks of...
The only power workers had was their unity. There were no laws recognizing unions or protecting union membership. The government didn't support the organizing of workers. On the contrary, the government bolstered the efforts of employers to resist unions by supplementing company strikebreakers with government troops. As the struggle became increasingly bitter, the Canadian government needed to develop an alternative strategy to intervention through force. In 1900, Canada's first Department of Labor was established. William Lyon Mackenzie King, the man who would shape government labor policy for the next 50 years, was given the key position of Deputy Minister of Labor. King called himself a friend of the working man. He didn't believe workers needed unions. He believed government could offer them more by acting as a referee in labor disputes. In 1907, legislation was passed which guaranteed a role for government. Workers in certain industries were prohibited from striking until they had submitted a dispute to a government conciliation board. In 1910, the workers' friend, now Minister of Labor, intervened in a strike by workers employed by Grand Trunk Railway. King resolved the dispute by mediating a settlement which amounted to a betrayal of promises made to the union. By the terms of the settlement, Grand Trunk fired 250 strikers, canceled all pension benefits, and the government agreed to find jobs for the strikebreakers Grand Trunk had hired. In the following year, the Liberal government was defeated. Mackenzie King was out of a job, but it didn't take long for him to find buyers for his conciliation services. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., the wealthiest man in America, put King on his payroll. In 1913, coal miners working in Rockefeller's Colorado mines went on strike for a living wage and union recognition.
It was early springtime and the strike was on. It drove us miners out of doors, out from the houses that the company owned. We moved into tents up at Old Ludlow.
Rockefeller sent in private troops and the Colorado militia to break the strike. Strikers were shot, and tents housing wives and children were doused with paraffin and set ablaze.
In the blaze it started. You pulled the triggers of your Gatling guns. I made a run for the children, but a firewall stopped me. 13 children died from your gun.
King was then brought in to salvage Rockefeller's reputation. He accompanied Rockefeller to Colorado and encouraged Rockefeller to call the miners his partners and to dance with their wives. He disbanded the Mine Workers Union and constructed a company union through which miners could air grievances but not negotiate. After a 13-month strike, the miners returned to work without a wage increase and without a union. King called Rockefeller and his executives the best men in America and true friends. The Colorado experience inspired King to write a book about his vision of a new industrial order. Entitled Industry and Humanity, it contained charts of cosmic harmony showing how labor, capital, management, and the community should work together, with management at the center of power. He wrote, "No longer will industry be the battleground of rival and contending factions. It will become the foundation of a new civilization in which life and happiness abound." While King was drawing mystical charts of blissful harmony, World War I was ending. As Canadian soldiers returned home, they found that jobs were scarce and that price rises had left wages far behind. Strikes for the return of pre-war purchasing power and for union recognition broke out across the country. This movement culminated in the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. Faced with mounting worker demands, the government once again bared the iron fist. The municipal police, ordered to disband the Winnipeg strikers, were dismissed when they refused to sign a no-strike pledge. In their stead, the Borden Conservative government called in the Mounties and the military. The troops drove through the streets in trucks mounted with machine guns. 10 union leaders were arrested. 24 strikers were wounded or killed. The Borden government excused this assault as a necessary response to an attempt by aliens to start a Bolshevik revolution in Winnipeg. In 1921, Mackenzie King became Prime Minister. King's Minister of Labor also used the fear of Bolshevism to justify repression of workers. Cape Breton coal miners were striking over a series of wage cuts. The government branded the militancy of the miners subversive and sent the militia to Nova Scotia 3 times to counter this subversion. The miners and their families were eventually starved into submission. Prosperity never returned to Cape Breton. But through the 1920s, industry was booming in the rest of Canada. The boom was short-lived. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the Depression began.
I don't want your billions, mister. I don't want your diamond ring. All I want's the right to live, mister. Give it to me, my job again.
Thousands of people lost their jobs. The unemployed rode the rails looking for work or were herded into 20-cent-a-day relief camps supervised by troops. In 1935, the unemployed, battling for jobs and unemployment insurance, began an on-to-Ottawa trek from all parts of the country.
I know you have landed, mister.
They were halted in Regina, where Ottawa ordered out the RCMP, which launched a violent attack on the 1,000 unemployed workers camped in the city.
Where's the work that you did, mister? I'm asking for my job again.
As the Depression began to ease, the militancy of workers increased. In 1937, a landmark in the struggle for union recognition was achieved by auto workers in Oshawa, striking against GM. Despite a special squad of police sent in to break the strike, the workers remained solid and won a contract containing a wage increase and a 44-hour week. Mackenzie King, elected to his third term in office in 1935, was not influenced by the victory for union recognition won in Oshawa. King still believed in his scheme of a government-orchestrated labor management team, with management at the helm. On a trip to Germany in 1937, King found a working example of his vision. King discovered Hitler's Beauty of Work program, a scheme comprised of a 60-hour work week, wage controls, and the internment of dissenters in concentration camps. What King praised were the councils of trust, which advised employers on discipline and working conditions, and the courts of social honor, where workers and employers were prosecuted for fostering conflict. On his return home, King wrote in his diary, "They are truly establishing an industrial commonwealth, and other nations would be wise to evolve rapidly on similar lines. Of all that I have seen on this trip abroad, I have been more impressed and more heartened by what seems to be working itself in Germany than by almost anything else." And when the German Industrial Commonwealth plunged the world into the Second World War, King got the opportunity to put into practice some of what he had observed abroad. In 1942, the King government began promoting labor management production committees and commissioned the National Film Board to make films supporting this policy.
Today, the world needs all that Canada can produce. Industry can best fill that need, not through speed up, but through labor management cooperation. Cooperation and teamwork among men have always been the keys to industrial progress and the growth of civilization.
During the war years, union membership increased dramatically. Very large numbers of women began working in war industry plants, adding greater force to the labor movement. In 1943, a rash of strikes broke out, almost all over the issue of union recognition. By 1944, the demands of the workers who were the backbone of Canada's war industries could be ignored no longer. The government passed Privy Council Order 1003, setting up a scheme under which union recognition and collective bargaining rights were acknowledged. This system legalized and regulated the victories won by Canadian workers over the previous 50 years.
In being true to our liberal faith, we shall be...
In 1948, Prime Minister Mackenzie King retired. John D. Rockefeller presented King with $100,000 worth of shares in his empire. It was friends like Rockefeller who had benefited most from King's ideas of government intervention and labor management cooperation, ideas which had become permanent features of Canadian government policy. A generation later, enter Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
We talk to a Canadian as a whole human being, one who is concerned with the problems of all this country, no matter where he lives. And that's why.
In 1968, Trudeau became Prime Minister. Trudeau would give new meaning to King's policy of intervention. In the years before Trudeau, the amount of unionized workers had been growing steadily. The numbers of workers employed by federal and provincial governments had also been increasing. These workers, largely women, were unorganized, and there were glaring inequities between themselves and unionized workers. By the early 1970s, workers in both the federal and provincial public sectors had achieved collective bargaining rights. Labor relations entered a new phase as the government tested its muscle as an employer as well as a legislator. Federal and provincial governments began to whittle away at the right to strike, ordering workers back to work and imposing compulsory arbitration of agreements. And then on October 13th, 1975, the federal government took a historic step.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honorable Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
Good evening. Tomorrow, the Government of Canada will ask Parliament for the authority to impose severe restraints upon rising prices and incomes. This program of restraint is the heaviest imposed upon Canadians since the Second World War.
Demonstrations broke out across the country. Controls were supposed to curb inflation, but prices and profits continued to rise. Even more ominous, the imposition of controls removed wages from the sphere of collective bargaining, undercutting one of the most basic of union principles.
Well, it's a rollback of you, and it's a rollback of me, and it's a rollback of workers of BC and all across this country far and wide. But we're here today for all to see trade union solidarity. We're tired of being taken for a ride. Well, the workers in the factories and in the mines and the mills and on the seas are fed up with the anti-inflation board. We're tired of being the phony ploys for Trudeau and his backroom boys. We've had it with the anti-inflation board. Well, it's a rollback of you, and it's a rollback of me, and it's a rollback.
From 1975 to the present, the federal and provincial governments have ordered striking workers back to work on numerous occasions. growing tendency of the government to suspend the right to strike and meddle in collective bargaining is an outgrowth of a policy of intervention begun in 1907. Over the last century, workers have struggled with dignity and courage to achieve the goal of a better life. Throughout the history of the labor movement, the government has alternately acknowledged and restricted the union rights won by workers. A message has become apparent. What the government gives, it can also take away.
It was deep night when we began. The road was narrow, we took our stand. We saw our way of growing motion turn from a stream into an ocean. We saw our way of growing motion turn from a stream into an ocean. Though the past dims as we move on, our old victories can't be undone, and these old battles that are no longer still give us hope and make us stronger. And these old battles that are no longer still give us hope and make us stronger. So it's darkest before the dawn. This thought keeps us moving on. What we have won through pain and sorrow, we must ensure we'll live tomorrow. What we have won through pain and sorrow, we must ensure we'll live tomorrow. You know it's darkest before the dawn. This thought keeps us moving on. If we could heed these early warnings, the time is now, quite early morning. If we could heed these early warnings, the time is now, quite early morning.